Greetings, adventurers. Welcome back to the channel. It is I, Eric's UK, with a continuation of the Pathfinder First Edition campaign that I'm running, called Chaos and Limbo. We were supposed to play a month ago, Halloween night, and unfortunately I wasn't able to do it. I was sent home from work on the Friday due to not being well, and it got worse over the weekend, and I was just not in a fit state to do anything but basically sit in bed and watch bad horror movies on the telly. So the game had to wait until last weekend. And where we left off, they were exploring the mines of the Griffin Claw mining settlement, or as they've now deemed it, Gryffindor mines. And they had an encounter with some cultists, basically. Human servants or whatever this weirdness is in the mines and what's going on. And this was a bit of a challenge, but they managed to put them down. And through this, they managed to locate the mine boss. I say this because they know that he's not human. He's something entirely different. He's a more powerful version of whatever these strange things are. And they basically find him in the depths of the mine, in a chamber with 4 cloaked figures who are chanting so loudly that the party was able, even with some armoured characters rather, to sneak up close to the entrance to this chamber and see what's going on. And there's basically these 4 chanting figures standing across from one another around a mound of body parts, the remains of the miners, basically. Very grisly scene. And this figure, this large, well-built man, who is obviously the mine boss, standing there mumbling and grumbling and saying something in a language none of them understood. So with the surprise element, they charged in, they smacked one of these chanty robed figures, and he basically just went into goo on the floor and melted. And they were able to take out these 4 guys fairly quickly. However, the boss man is obviously some sort of horrible beastie, and he starts to go all transfiguration and becoming whatever he wants to be, and even starts to meld into the bodies on the floor and become a part of those. And they start lashing out as like fleshy arms and limbs and sort of like tentacles. And this was quite a really tough fight. Thankfully, they were able to make it through a couple of well-planned or well-thought-out invisibility spells and one scroll of protection from chaos, which they had found, which was quite appropriate because I always roll random treasure in my homebrew scenarios and campaigns, so it was quite appropriate, and that actually saved the Dwarf Slayer from a critical hit from this thing, which would have killed him outright. And they come out of there quite bloodied, after finally destroying whatever this thing was. And they found that the guards that had been waiting outside the mine, which they knew to be more of these things, had also all melted as well. So presumably with the loss of this big gribbly, they'd all died or gone back wherever they come from, wherever. The survivors in the town are really grateful, and the party, and they basically say that they'll put them up for the night and free drinks, food, whatever they can, but they don't really want to stay too long. The party decide they want to get going. They've got these notes that were found in the house of the dead guy that they found on the way in, and they want to basically try and track down his sister and find out what's going on. So they stay for the night and then they head back. Not a problem. Somebody steps in to be the mine boss, until somebody else turns up. But interestingly enough, once they got back to the town of Garnet, nobody mentions that they might need help up there. or that the town's decimated, or what have you. They basically just say, yeah, we've dealt with the problem, and they left it. So once again, they rest up. I let them level at this point. And again, they start debating how they're going to find this sister, this Hilda. Talking to their contacts here in Garnet, the investigator, and Rex's father on the town guard. They're still a little bit perplexed. A little bit of local flavour that I dropped in the previous session. They were sort of like debating the morality or ethics or whatever of it. Basically, the idea that the cultists they brought from the actual mines in the earlier scenarios, they'd used magic to coerce him to talk. But there's a general thing, sort of like science fiction or whatever, that anything that's sort of brought out from somebody magically or psychically isn't admissible in court. So, knowing that the nation they are in, Darakeen, is a highly lawful, neutral society, I had said that anything like that is not admissible. You can't basically judge the person based on something that's brought forth through magic. I mean, and they were saying, well, that's really silly because magic is magic. Although they were discussing it not at me, they were discussing it in the purposes of the game. But that was a nice little bit. At least some flavour in the campaign had brought up a slight discussion while we were having a break. And they decided to head off to the city of Darakeen, which they do. Their merchant friend was quite happy to get out of there after all this, and he knows Darakeen and the nation, and he's been to the city a few times, so he can drop them off at the large market area where they might be able to find some information. So once out of the mountains, it's much nicer, much warmer sort of climate, and Darakeen city is a very large city, and it's kind of a little bit cosmopolitan. There are various races and cultures, and they get dropped off in the market, and they basically but see, this is quite interesting because they wanted, one half of the party wanted to go and find the sister immediately, start talking to people. The other half wanted to find a tavern where they could book rooms because they figure they're going to be here for a while, and there was a little bit of discussion about what's more important here, So in the end, they decided to do both. Thankfully, they're not in a dungeon, so the idea of don't split the party wasn't overly relevant. But and half the party went looking for a decent tavern, and I pulled up. There's a website I use for random names, and I noticed on this particular session it even has a tavern name generator. So I popped that in, and it comes up some really silly, really silly options. But the one that came up that we went with was the Thundering Turkey, which I thought is a cool tavern name. Let's go for it, So they're staying at the Thundering Turkey. We were discussing what the sign should be outside, whether it should just be like a big muscular turkey, or whether it should be like a turkey version of Thor, which I think is what we went for. What was I? Yes. So one half of the party, the one that's staying in the tavern, basically starts asking around there for any jobs, because they come up with the ideas that it might take them a while, if they're not lucky, to find this Hilda. After all, the only thing they know about her is her name, and that she's from the Empire of Sonstal, which is some leagues over the mountains to the east. So at least she might stand out as not being a Darakeen. So they ask around. I think it was Rex, the sorcerer, actually has performed singing, which I had forgotten about, and he made some amazing roles and made them some money, and they managed to basically ask around, and they get directed to a nobleman who looks very weary and, you know, depressed, sat at a table, and talking to him, they find out that he owns a sizable vineyard east, or rather north of Darakeen, and it has basically been taken over by a dragon. And they're like, "There's no one gone to deal with it," and he's like, "It's a dragon. You know, it's not burning down the vineyard, it's not slaughtering people, but it's a dragon. Nobody's going out there, you know." But he says, you know, it's not a huge dragon. You know, we're not talking about some ancient adult or something like that. He says it's basically, he's seen it flying in, carrying its hoard, repeated trips, carrying these chests and whatnot, and it's got a red coloration. So he's basically had to move out of there, and that's his whole wealth and livestock, or, you know, livelihood tied up in this place. And if they're willing to go in there and slay the dragon for him, they can keep the hoard. He doesn't want it. He just wants his vineyard back. He just wants his house back. You know, and they're like, "It's a dragon," but it's an idea. So whether or not they will, now I have plans for this, so I've got it written up just in case. But I don't think they'll get to that on the next session, which is this coming weekend. As for the other group, they go asking around, and they do find out that there is a Sonstal district, as it were, where people from that nation actually sort of like congregate, kind of like you see in cities in the real world anyway. And one of them gets a phenomenal role. He gets something like a 25 on his gather info, which technically gives you hidden information, this sort of thing. And they do actually find out that there is a Hilda, who has a brother who hasn't been seen for some time. He left months ago, and that she's a witch. So they check this out, and it does indeed turn out to be the relevant woman. They are actually quite tactful for my players in explaining that he's dead. And she explains that her brother and her, they're not really adventurers, but they did deal with a cult. She's more of a sage sort of thing, so she's more knowledgeable about whatnot. But she explains that a year or so ago, they dealt with a cult here in Darakeen City, which was based out of a noble household. People had gone missing, and it took some coercion and diplomacy to get the Watch to actually investigate, because obviously these are nobles, they're almost above the law. The Watch generally leave them alone because they can cause trouble, but they eventually managed to get them to go in, and they managed to basically stop a cult ritual. The nobles had or were found prostrating themselves before this large stone statue of like a tentacled frog thing. And they rescued a potential sacrifice, and basically the family members were all killed in the fight and the cult destroyed. No one was able to identify what this statue was at the time. Since then, she's been able to unearth that it represents something called a primordial, which she says is kind of like the stories of the great old ones. They are beings that predated the formation of the multiverse, but there's next to nothing on them. There's very little lore. There's no one's claimed to ever have encountered one. So she's not really sure where this came from. But this family were definitely worshipping this statue of a primordial. And her brother had basically sometime later heard of something similar happening up near Garnet, which is why he decided to set off and investigate. And obviously he's found something you know. She's all kind of distraught and upset, but you know, if this cult or whatever it is still active, she wants to help stop it, so she's willing to help them. They also ask her about the strange, bald, red-robed cultist figure that they encountered in the mines below Garnet, and there's a hint of recognition in her eyes. And before they can say anything else, she grabs some parchment and a quill and draws a rough but accurate looking description of this person. And she goes, "Is this him?" I'm like, "Wow, yes." And she explains, well, she puts sort of a little bit of lore from my worldless game world. And she asks, basically, why do you think there are so many dungeons in the world? You know, there's these ancient complexes buried beneath the earth. There's ruins scattered across the realms, and you know, there's ancient haunted abandoned castles in the middle of nowhere in deep dark forests. You know, where do these all come from? People don't just build underground, you know, unless you're dwarves. You don't generally build large underground subterranean complexes, and you don't build creepy castles out in the middle of nowhere. And she's all, from her investigations and her readings, she has learnt about something that is referred to, because no one knows what it actually is, as a dungeon dragon. And this is an idea that I took from, I think, the Tome of Horrors monster book from Necromancer Games, where basically there is an entity that constructs these things, fills it with treasure, traps, and brings in creatures to populate it, and then uses it to sort of like test and play with adventurers and peoples. And she thinks this is what this is, and they kind of agree, you know, considering it seems to have some control over how you get in and out of this thing in the mines, in these dungeons. She's wondering whether this is what they've encountered, but it's nothing to do with the primordials, it's something else. So they're kind of a little bit intrigued, a little bit confused, and slightly worried as well. Pardon me, if I'm honest. They go back, they pick up everyone else, they explain about the dragon, there's a potential another job, and they decide that they're going to investigate the manor house that was the site of the cult here. And this is basically sort of wrapped up. They approached, and they think they see somebody slipping through the front doors. So they call out, you know, "Who's in there?" Blah, 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 blah. And they just hear these sort of like phantom, sort of ghost noises. Not to be put off by that, they burst in and find 3 swashbucklery looking rogue types, pardon me, who basically demand they turn and leave. And when the party don't, they go, "Well, on guard." Boom, 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 boom. And the catfolk Shifter decides, right, he's going to scare them, he's going to put some injuries, he does his transformation thing, he grows his claws, he bares his teeth, he literally shreds this guy's like 3rd level, and he literally just tears him down. And he's standing over this bloodied, torn corpse, and he's like, "Oh." At which point the other two sort of like drop their weapons. 2 other guys emerge from side doors going, "Fair game, you know, didn't really like him anyway, we're just here to loot the place." You know, so they've basically killed one guy out of a group of rogues, and they've sent them packing, basically, "Bugger off, don't come back, you know, stay out of places like this." But the cat folk's now feeling really, really sad, because this wasn't some big bad, this was just some bloke. Which I thought was quite a nice bit of roleplay. actually feeling, considering that in like one of the first scenarios, the paladin fed a cultist to a mimic. It's kind of nice to see one of the characters now showing a little bit of remorse for killing, essentially an innocent person. But that's where we've wrapped up. So I imagine that the next session is this coming Sunday is going to end up being the exploration of the house and the dungeon beneath it, which isn't particularly big. It's just there to give them a bit more information of what's going on. It was a good session. I really enjoyed it. There were some laughs. There was some, nice cinematic moments, and some cool interaction between the players, myself, and the game world, which is really what you want out of a good session. But that's where Chaos in Limbo is up to at the moment. So I know it's kind of a bit of a waffle, but I hope you enjoyed it and following along. I'll try and get the follow-up to this vid done a lot sooner, rather than leave you all in weeks. But until next time, thanks for watching, guys. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next vid. Take care. Until next time, good gaming.